It's strange how some stories don't begin with a loud moment, but with something quiet. Something that, at first, doesn't even feel unusual. A missed call, a door left unlocked, a routine that breaks, just slightly. And for a few days, nothing about it seems urgent. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, the kind that take their time, that look closely at the details, consider subscribing. It helps more than you might think, and it keeps these investigations going. And as you listen, pay attention to the small things. Sometimes the detail that feels unimportant at first is the one that changes everything. If something stands out to you, you can share it in the comments. Many people notice different pieces of the same story, and that perspective can matter. But in this case, for several days, something didn't make sense. Nancy Guthrie was not the kind of person who disappeared. That's not just a phrase people say after the fact. According to those who knew her, family, neighbors, even casual acquaintances, Nancy lived a life built on routine. The kind of routine that creates predictability. And predictability, in cases like this, is important. Because when it breaks, it leaves a very clear outline. Nancy was 68 years old, recently retired. She lived alone, but not isolated. There were regular calls with her daughter, weekly grocery trips, the same walking route in the mornings, the same chair by the window in the evenings. Nothing about her life suggested risk, and that's exactly why her disappearance became so unsettling. Because when someone with a chaotic life goes missing, investigators often have multiple directions to look. But when someone like Nancy disappears, there are fewer explanations. And fewer explanations mean each one carries more weight. Now, here's where the timeline becomes important. According to reports, the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie was on a Tuesday afternoon. A neighbor saw her bringing in a small bag of groceries. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But then, something subtle happened. Nancy didn't make her usual phone call that evening. At first, that didn't raise alarm. People forget. People get tired. Especially at her age, small changes in routine can happen. But then, Wednesday passed, and Thursday, and by Friday, the silence started to feel different. Because it wasn't just one missed moment anymore. It was a pattern breaking apart. Investigators say the first official concern came from a family member who hadn't been able to reach her. Calls went unanswered, messages weren't returned, and that's when the situation shifted, from unusual to concerning. Now, when law enforcement entered Nancy's home, what they found was not what you might expect. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks, no obvious struggle. And that detail, simple as it sounds, changes everything. Because when there's no forced entry, it suggests one of two things. Either Nancy left on her own, or she let someone in. And both possibilities carry very different implications. Let's slow that down for a moment. If she left on her own, there would usually be signs, packed items, missing essentials, a note, or at least some indication of planning. But according to investigators, many of Nancy's personal belongings were still inside. Her phone, her purse, items that most people don't leave behind voluntarily. Which brings us to the second possibility. She opened the door. And that idea is where the case begins to deepen. Because if Nancy opened the door for someone, it suggests familiarity, trust, or at the very least, recognition. This wasn't a random break-in. This was an interaction. But here's where things get complicated. There were no immediate suspects, no clear person of interest in the early stages. And that creates a different kind of problem for investigators. Not a lack of evidence, but a lack of direction. Because when you don't know where to look, every possibility stays open. And when every possibility stays open, the case becomes harder to narrow down. Now, in situations like this, investigators often turn to what's called environmental reconstruction. That sounds technical, but the idea is simple. You rebuild the last known movements of the person, minute by minute if possible. Where they went, who they spoke to, what they touched, what changed. And sometimes, it's not what's there that matters, it's what's missing. According to early reports, one detail stood out. Nancy's routine had been interrupted earlier that same day, before she disappeared. There was an unexpected visit. Now, the exact details of that visit are unclear. Investigators have not publicly confirmed who the visitor was, but neighbors reported seeing a vehicle that didn't belong to anyone in the immediate area. At first, that might not seem significant. People have visitors all the time. But in this context, it becomes something else. Because when a routine person experiences a break in routine, that break becomes the focal point. And this is where the timeline starts to tighten. The unknown vehicle was seen sometime between late morning and early afternoon. Nancy was last seen later that afternoon. And after that, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No verified movements. Just silence. Now, let's look at what investigators typically do next in a case like this. They begin with surveillance. Not just cameras from Nancy's home, if any existed, but from the surrounding area. Street cameras, traffic cameras, even private security systems from nearby houses. And this process takes time because you're not just looking for Nancy. You're looking for patterns. A car that appears more than once. A person who lingers too long. A movement that doesn't fit. And according to investigators, this is where the case began to shift slightly. Because footage from nearby streets reportedly captured a vehicle matching the description given by neighbors. But here's the issue. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the driver. So now, investigators had something, but not enough. A presence without a face. A lead without confirmation. And that kind of evidence sits in a difficult place. It's too important to ignore, but too incomplete to act on directly. Now, around this time, media attention started to grow. And that's when investigative journalist Brian Entin became involved. Entin is known for covering high-profile missing persons cases. His approach is methodical. He doesn't just repeat official statements, he looks for gaps, inconsistencies, things that don't quite align. And in Nancy's case, there were several. For example, the timing of the unknown vehicle. Why was it there? Who was inside? And perhaps most importantly, did Nancy know them? These questions may sound simple, but they open deeper layers. Because if Nancy recognized the person, then this wasn't random. And if it wasn't random, then the list of possibilities becomes smaller, but more personal. Family, friends, service workers, anyone who had a reason to approach her door without raising suspicion. But if she didn't recognize them, then something else happened. Something that caused her to open that door anyway. And that possibility introduces a different kind of concern. Now, according to reports, investigators also began analyzing phone records, not just Nancy's, but calls made to and from her number in the days leading up to her disappearance. This is a standard process, but it can reveal patterns, frequent contacts, unknown numbers, sudden changes in communication. And sometimes, it reveals something unexpected. At this stage, officials have not publicly released detailed findings from that analysis, but sources close to the investigation suggest there was at least one number that stood out. a number that appeared shortly before Nancy went missing. Again, the exact details are unclear, but the existence of that number adds another layer. Because now, we're not just looking at a physical presence. We're looking at a connection, and connections can be traced. But tracing them takes time, and time, in cases like this, becomes a critical factor. Because the longer someone is missing, the more complicated the investigation becomes. Evidence fades, memories blur, opportunities narrow, and this is where Brian Entin's involvement starts to matter more. Because while investigators work within protocols and procedures, journalists can sometimes explore angles that aren't immediately visible. They ask different questions, they speak to different people, and sometimes they notice things that others don't. In the early days of his coverage, Entin focused on one specific detail: the gap. Not the disappearance itself, but the time leading up to it. Because that's often where the truth hides. Not in the moment something happens, but in the quiet build-up before it. And as he began looking closer at that window of time, something didn't quite add up. A small inconsistency, a detail that seemed minor at first, but didn't fit when placed next to everything else. And that's when the case took a turn. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a press conference or a sudden announcement. It happened quietly, in the background, where most investigations actually move forward. Then something changed. Up to this point, everything we've talked about, the unknown vehicle, the repeated phone number, the possible interaction at the door, all of it pointed in one direction: connection. But connection alone isn't enough. Investigators need something they can hold on to, something that moves a case from theory into action. And according to multiple reports, that's exactly what began to develop. A lead. Now, it's important to understand what a lead really means in a case like this. It doesn't mean a solved mystery. It doesn't mean an identified suspect. It means there is finally a direction that holds together under pressure. A path that doesn't collapse when tested against evidence. And this particular lead appeared to connect several of the case's most uncertain pieces: the phone number, the visit, and possibly the reason Nancy would open her door. But here's where we need to slow down again. Because leads can be misleading. They can look strong at first, and then fall apart. So investigators don't just follow them, they test them. They ask, does this person have access? Do they have a reason to be there? Can they be placed at or near the scene? And, most importantly, do they connect to the victim in a believable way? Now, according to sources familiar with the investigation, the number that had appeared in Nancy's call history was traced, at least partially. Not to a public listing, not to something easily searchable, but to a line that had limited identification attached to it. And that is unusual. Because most phone numbers today leave some kind of trail. But when a number is harder to trace, it suggests one of a few things. It could be newly activated, it could be registered under a different name, or it could be deliberately obscured. And each of those possibilities carries a different implication. But they all point to one idea. Someone may not have wanted to be easily found. Now, Brian Entin began focusing more directly on this angle. Not just the number itself, but the pattern around it. When did it appear? How often did it connect? And what happened immediately after? Because timing, in investigations like this, often reveals intent. And here's what started to stand out. The calls or messages linked to that number didn't stretch back months. They were recent. Close to the day Nancy disappeared. Close enough to feel connected. Now, imagine that from Nancy's perspective. A new contact. a reason to communicate, possibly even a reason to expect someone. And that last idea is critical. Because if Nancy was expecting someone, then the moment at the door changes completely. It's no longer unexpected. It becomes anticipated. And anticipation lowers defenses. People open doors more easily when they believe they know who's on the other side. But here's where things begin to tighten. Investigators reportedly compared the timing of that number's activity with the estimated window of the unknown vehicle's presence. And there was overlap. Not perfect, not exact, but enough to raise concern. Because now, two separate threads, the digital and the physical, are beginning to align. And when independent pieces of evidence start pointing in the same direction, that's when a case begins to take shape. But there was still a problem. No clear identity, no confirmed name attached to the number, no definitive proof that the person linked to that phone was the same person seen near Nancy's home. And without that, everything remains just short of actionable. Now, around this stage, investigators often widen their approach. They don't just focus on one lead, they build outward from it. They look at who has used similar numbers, who has had recent contact with Nancy, who had a reason, legitimate or not, to approach her home. And sometimes that process uncovers something unexpected. Not a direct answer, but a connection that wasn't visible before. And according to emerging reports, that's exactly what may have happened. A name began to surface, not publicly, not confirmed, but within investigative circles. A person of interest, someone whose background, at least in part, aligned with what they were seeing. Now, again, we need to be careful here. Person of interest does not mean suspect. It means someone who may have information, someone worth speaking to, someone whose connection, however small, deserves attention. But even that changes the tone of the case, because now, instead of searching in all directions, investigators are beginning to focus, and focus brings pressure, because once a person becomes part of an investigation, their movements, their history, their connections, all of it begins to be examined. And this is where Brian Entin's reporting added something new. He didn't reveal the name, but he hinted at the nature of the connection. According to his coverage, the individual may have had a reason to contact Nancy that would not immediately raise suspicion. Something routine, something explainable, something that could justify both the phone contact and the visit. And when you hear that, it brings us back to that earlier detail. The scheduled service. The possibility that Nancy was expecting someone. Now, if those two elements connect, then we're no longer looking at coincidence. We're looking at opportunity. Because a scheduled visit creates access. It creates a reason to approach the door without resistance. And if someone intended to use that access, then the entire sequence of events begins to look different, more structured, more deliberate. But even here, there are still gaps. Because having access doesn't explain what happened next. It doesn't explain why Nancy disappeared without a trace. It doesn't explain the absence of physical evidence inside the home. And it doesn't explain what may have happened after that door was opened. So while the lead brings direction, it also raises deeper questions. What was said during that interaction? Did Nancy step outside, or did the person enter? Was there a moment where she realized something was wrong? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, was this planned from the beginning? Now, as investigators continued to work through these possibilities, one more development began to surface. It didn't come from inside the house. It came from outside the immediate area. A possible movement, a vehicle, similar to the one seen earlier, captured again, but this time farther away. And that changes the scale of the case completely. Because now, we're not just looking at what happened at Nancy's home. We're looking at where things may have gone next. And that's when the investigation takes another turn. Because up until now, everything has been centered around one place. Nancy's home, her street, that short window of time where something went wrong. But the moment investigators believe movement occurred beyond that area, the case expands, not just in size, but in complexity. Because once a person is moved from the original location, every mile adds uncertainty. Every minute creates distance, not just physically, but evidentially. So let's walk through this carefully. According to developing reports, traffic and security cameras from a neighboring area, several miles away, captured a vehicle that resembled the one described earlier. Not identical, at least not confirmed, but similar enough in shape, color, and timing to draw attention. Now, that kind of match isn't enough to act on by itself. Vehicles can look alike. Lighting can distort details. Angles can mislead. So investigators don't jump to conclusions. They compare, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp, movement by movement. And what they look for isn't just the vehicle itself. It's the behavior. Does it slow down near certain points? Does it stop anywhere unusual? Does it reappear in multiple locations along a logical path? Because when behavior aligns, that's when similarity becomes something more. And according to sources, there was at least one detail that stood out: the timing. The second sighting of this vehicle fell within a window that investigators were already focused on, the hours immediately following Nancy's disappearance. That overlap doesn't confirm anything, but it strengthens the possibility that the two sightings are connected. Now, here's where the investigation becomes more technical. When a vehicle is seen in multiple locations, investigators begin what's called route reconstruction. They don't just look at where the car was, they map where it could have gone, based on road networks, traffic patterns, signal timings, even typical driving behavior in that area. And from that, they begin to build possible paths. Not one path, but several, each one representing a different possibility. Now, this process is slow, and it's not always precise, but it helps answer an important question. If this vehicle is connected, where might it have gone? And that question matters because it opens up the next phase of the case. Search. Not just of Nancy's home or immediate neighborhood, but of surrounding areas that fall along those possible routes. Now, at this stage, law enforcement typically works with multiple units: ground teams, aerial support, sometimes even specialized search groups trained to look for subtle signs, disturbed lard, broken vegetation, anything that suggests recent activity. But here's the challenge. Without a confirmed destination, the search area becomes very large. And large areas are difficult to cover completely. So investigators have to narrow it down. They return to the evidence, the timing of the vehicle, the possible identity linked to the phone number, the nature of the interaction at Nancy's home, and they begin to ask, what would make sense? Not just what's possible, but what's likely. Would the person stay close or move farther away? Would they choose a place they know or somewhere unfamiliar? And these aren't just guesses. They're based on patterns seen in other cases. Because behavior, even in crimes, often follows certain tendencies. Now, around this same time, another detail began to surface. It came from something many people overlook: digital movement. Not calls this time, but location data. Now, to be clear, this type of data isn't always precise. It depends on signal strength, tower connections, and device settings. but it can give a general idea of where a phone was or wasn't. And according to sources close to the investigation, there may have been a brief signal connected to that same unidentified number detected outside Nancy's immediate area. Again, not confirmed publicly, but, if accurate, it suggests movement. Movement that aligns with the second vehicle sighting. And when digital data and physical sightings begin to overlap, the picture starts to sharpen. Still incomplete, but clearer. Now, Brian Entin's reporting began to reflect this shift. He didn't present it as a breakthrough. He framed it as a development, a possible extension of the timeline. Because that's what this is. Not a conclusion, but a continuation. The story doesn't end at Nancy's door. It may have just begun there. And this is where the emotional weight of the case deepens. Because as the investigation moves outward, the uncertainty grows. What happened after she left that home? If she left at all? Where was she taken? Was she alone? Was there more than one person involved? And these questions don't just sit with investigators. They sit with families, with communities, with anyone following the case. Because the lack of answers creates space. And that space is difficult to live with. Now, as search efforts expanded, investigators reportedly focused on specific zones along the potential route, areas that are less populated, less visible, places where a vehicle could stop without drawing attention. And in cases like this, those areas become critical, because they offer privacy. And privacy can be used in different ways. But here's where we need to be careful again. At this stage, nothing has been publicly confirmed about what, if anything, was found in those areas. Searches take time, and results, if there are any, are not always immediate. But the fact that those areas are being examined tells us something important. Investigators believe the answer may lie beyond the original scene. Now, one final element began to emerge during this phase. It wasn't from cameras. It wasn't from phone records. It came from people. Someone, according to reports, may have come forward, not as a witness to the disappearance itself, but with information connected to the individual linked to that phone number. And that changes things again. Because information from people, when it aligns with physical and digital evidence, can become very powerful. It can confirm suspicions. It can clarify timelines. And sometimes, it can identify a person. But at this point, details remain limited. Investigators are cautious. They don't release more than they have to. Because once information becomes public, it can affect the direction of the case. So they hold it back, they verify, they test, and they move carefully. But the presence of that information suggests something is building, piece by piece, quietly. And that quiet buildup is often what leads to the most significant shifts. Because cases like this don't always break open with a single moment. Sometimes they tighten, slowly, until there's only one direction left. And that's when everything changes.